Hello. So this video is a performance review of Eugene Ionesco's Rhinoceros, performed by the Penn State School of Theater under the direction of Sam Osheroff. So I really like theater of the absurd. It's one of my favorite genres of theater, and Ionesco is one of the masters of theater of the absurd. Rhinoceros is an amazing play. I read it a long time ago. It's got to be the better, if not a decade, the better part of a decade ago now. And I watched the film version with Gene Wilder, which was good. Gene Wilder, always amazing. But from what I remember of the film version, I liked the Penn State theater production better. Maybe that's because it was live theater as opposed to a teleplay, but and maybe it's because I'm now, I don't know, this seems counterintuitive to me, but I am now older than I was when I watched the teleplay version, when I read the play, etc., etc. So maybe I'm just more comfortable with the absurdity of existence than I was in my naive youth. I don't know. But, so the play is about this young-ish, at least Frenchman, named Béranger. He is very neurotic, he's very anxious, he is driven by these sort of this feeling of discontent, of not belonging in the world, of not being sort of comfortable in himself, right? He's also an alcoholic. So he goes out with his friend Jean, who is very self-confident, he's very fastidious in his clothing. He's very loud and brash, and he has these sort of big opinions, and is a very dominating personality compared to Béranger, who is much more sort of meek, submissive, undecided, etc. And while they are at this cafe, and Jean is berating Béranger for drinking rather than improving his mind, a rhinoceros runs past. So it runs down the street, sort of crashing alongside the shop walls and stuff, and they're in an outdoor cafe, so it's right along the street next to them. This excites tremendous confusion amongst the people in this cafe, including Jean, including a logician, including a gentleman, the proprietor of the cafe, etc., etc. Because rhinoceroses are not part of the typical indigenous fauna of their small town in France. Béranger seems to recognize that the proper response is to be confused and fascinated by this, but he can't really muster up that much interest in this thing that has happened. The confusion and fear, anxiety that everyone experiences over this is increased when another rhinoceros runs by on the other side of the street, or the same rhinoceros. This excites a tremendous debate among Jean and Béranger, as well as the other people in the cafe, particularly the logician, over whether or not this was the same rhinoceros, a different rhinoceros, whether or not the first rhinoceros had one or two horns, whether or not the second rhinoceros had one or two horns, and whether or not the African rhinoceros has one or two horns, and the Asiatic rhinoceros has one or two horns. There's a whole debate about this. It's an extended debate, and it is an absurd debate. It's incredibly funny. particularly when the logician jumps in and he starts presenting all of these propositions and premises to say nothing, right? Because he ultimately has no data about the world as such, he cannot come to a real conclusion about whether or not this was the same rhinoceros or two different rhinoceroses, whether or not one or both of the rhinoceroses, if there were two, had one or two horns, whether or not the African rhinoceros has, whether the African rhinoceros has one or two horns, and whether the Asian or Asiatic rhinoceros has one or two horns. None of the questions that people are asking can actually be answered by logic, but the logician, who has this absurd absolute confidence in the ability of logic to determine the answer to any question, spins through this thought process. And at the end of it, Béranger and the rest of them are no closer than they were at the beginning to actually having answers to their questions, even though everyone, apart from Béranger, who remains inveterately confused, everyone else is incredibly impressed by the logician and compliments him on his fine solving of which question should be asked. So then we jump to Béranger's office, where there's a debate going on between Daisy, who is Béranger's love interest, also the love interest of Dudard, one of the other men in the office, and Botard. So Botard, who is this sort of conspiracy theorist, like, he believes that either the rhinoceroses are a conspiracy of journalists made up to deceive people, a mass delusion, or some kind of trick by the authorities for some as yet undetermined nefarious purpose. Daisy actually was in the cafe, and so she saw this rhinoceros or these rhinoceroses. The question is never answered whether it's one or two. And so she asserts the credibility of her own senses. Dudard, because he's in love with her, he sides with her. And there's a whole debate about this. Béranger arrives late, because he's perpetually arriving late. And he also asserts that he saw one or two rhinoceroses. Botard seizes on his uncertainty about whether it was one or two rhinoceroses to dismiss the whole thing. Then Madame Bouffe shows up, and she brings word from her husband that he cannot come into work today, and also that she has been chased from her flat to the office by a rhinoceros, who then proceeds to demolish the staircase, trapping them all upstairs. Madame Bouffe then recognizes that the rhinoceros is her husband, and so she leaps down onto her husband's back, and they ride off together. And so what we start to piece together is that people in town are transforming into rhinoceroses. This then proceeds with Jean transforming into a rhinoceros in his own apartment, while Béranger is there trying to apologize for their argument. Monsieur Papillon, Béranger's boss, Botard, the logician, the gentleman, all of these people transform into rhinoceroses until finally it is Béranger, Daisy, and Dudard. Dudard then decides that maybe it's not so bad being a rhinoceros, and he goes and transforms as well, and it is Daisy and Béranger left alone together. Finally, he has this relationship with her that he has always wanted, but he is unable to settle down. He is unable to sort of calm himself and enjoy this relationship with her. And so eventually she tires of his neuroses and tires of being one of the only two human beings, and she decides to go and join the rhinoceroses as well. And so Béranger is left alone at the end of the play, and he has this moment of existential despair in which he looks at himself in the mirror and determines that he, as a human being, is hideous, and it is in fact the rhinoceroses that are beautiful and right, and he wants to join them, even though this is the thing that he has been dead set against. He practices trying to trumpet like a rhinoceros, he practices charging, and then he says, no, I am a human being, and I'm going to remain a human being, even if I am the only human being. And that is the end of the play. It's his recommitment to his human identity, regardless of the pressure put upon him to conform by becoming a rhinoceros. So, in the program note, the about the play note in the program, it informs us that Ionesco was a witness to and shaped by the rise of fascism in Europe, and that is very true. During the 1930s and 40s, he alternated living in Romania, where he was born, and France, where his mother, I think his mother was part French. So he lived in Romania and France during the period of leading up to and then during World War II. Both Romania and France were heavily impacted, occupied, and had collaborative governments with fascistic regimes. And so Ionesco was very aware of this. And that's an important dimension of this play, right? There's an element of Rhinoceros that is a political allegory for resisting the rise of fascism. The rhinoceroses stand in for fascism and for this pressure to conform to this sort of anti-humanist ideology. This is the rhinoceros, right? One of the things is they are constantly talked about as charging, as trampling people. They're constantly talked about in this sort of violent terminology. And so there is that element of the association of fascism and violence, obviously, because fascism is inherently a violent ideology. And so there's that level of it. I also heard a person who I think they said that they were assistant lighting director or assistant lighting designer or associate lighting designer, something like that, who was explaining to two other audience members that this is an allegory of the rise of fascism, right? And that is an important component of the play, but I also think it misses a larger philosophical question that Ionesco is working through. So I do want to sort of be aware of that, right? Because theater of the absurd obviously is rooted in the philosophies of absurdism and existentialism, and some of the central questions of absurdism and existentialism are things like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be an individual? What is the meaning of life? Or how do we generate meaning and purpose within our lives? And I think this is the other major component of Rhinoceros. Some people turn to conventions, social mores, things like this, as a basis for escaping the fundamental meaninglessness of existence, right? The crisis of existence for existentialists and absurdists is the gap between the basic meaninglessness of existence versus the human desire or need for meaning. And different philosophers, different artists answer that question in different ways. So when, for instance, Béranger introduces this idea in the cafe when talking to Jean, that he drinks because he feels fundamentally disconnected from existence. He does not feel like he fits in the world, like he is uncomfortable in himself, right? This is the crisis of existence. And some people respond to that crisis through conformity and seeking meaning in social explanations, right? Whether that's fascism at the sort of far right extent, whether that is religion, whether that is membership in social or cultural organizations, whether that is complete identification with one's job, whether that is a sort of revolutionary fervor or whatever it is, right? There's something external upon which these people hang their identity and which provides them with meaning in their life. Others sort of retreat from the question of the absurd, right? Into and sort of embrace this bucolic resistance to thought or to engagement with the philosophy of existence. And in this sense, the rhinoceroses are a very fitting symbol of that, right? Because one of the things that the play sort of emphasizes is that they do not think in the way that humans think. They are not so troubled by the existential questions that humans are troubled by. And so we can, on the one hand, read the rhinoceroses as the growing rise of fascism within a society. We can also read it as human beings choosing to turn away from the challenging questions of the nature of existence, the nature of the absurd, and instead embrace non-thought, right? Or non-critical reflection. So I think that's a really interesting thing. The Penn State production itself. The acting was really, really good across the board. That's very standard for Penn State. I would expect nothing else. Jason Claudio, who played Béranger, gave us a really, really good neurotic character with this sort of anxious energy, this sort of constant feeling of like shifting and needing to be moving, never sort of able really to sit and just be stationary and be comfortable. And so that anxious energy of Béranger worked really, really well, despite the fact that Claudio had his arm in a cast. According to the person who was explaining the fascism dimension of it during intermission, he apparently dislocated his shoulder during a stage fall in one of the very late rehearsals, and so that, of course, had to have made his life much more difficult in performing this role, but he was still extremely good in it. And he really got that sense of like anxiety, fear, neuroses that constantly fills this character. And this was in contrast really to a character like Jean, played by Walker Reese, who was so supremely, almost arrogantly self-confident, and he, with his loud speech, his sort of booming proclamations of what Béranger should be doing with his life, and how Jean has everything figured out perfectly, etc., etc. So Reese really brought this sort of big energy to it. And then we also had a sort of contrast with someone like Lucian Silver, who played Dudard, whose first name I may be mispronouncing. I apologize if I am. That goes across the board, right? If I mispronounced anybody's name, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. But like Dudard is such a sort of, he's a straight man, right? The performance is very sort of was very sort of reserved. Silver gave a very sort of straight traditional performance as Dudard. He was a character who, or he was an actor who in this role did not sort of get excited about things, he was very calm, he was very deliberative, and it created these sort of interesting contrasts in energy between these different characters. The other thing that was really striking and cool about this production was some of the production elements themselves. So one big production element was when Jean transforms into a rhinoceros in his apartment with Béranger there. The initial part of the transformation was that Reese took his pajama top off to reveal this sort of gray-green, scaly skin like a rhinoceros, right? And that was a very tight-fitting undershirt that was designed to look like rhinoceros skin. But then at the end of that scene, from I think it was down the aisles between the audience, but it could have been from the exits. I can't remember. But were brought in 5 pieces of a giant rhinoceros puppet, and Reese took the head, and then the other puppeteers, which was the rest of the cast apart from Reese and Claudio, they either controlled the 4 quarters of the rhinoceros's body, or they were surrounding the rhinoceros and would periodically mock charge at the audience. All of this as the lights dimmed, and we got this very sort of ominous lighting, this very sort of ominous sounds, to really sort of highlight Béranger's existential terror in this moment as his best friend transforms into a rhinoceros. And then the other, Laurencio Ruiz was the puppet designer and mentor. And then the other thing that I thought was really, really cool was all of the props were hollow. And what I mean by that is not necessarily hollow as such. The door frames were, right? So the door to the cafe that then becomes the door to Jean's apartment and then to Béranger's apartment. We had a door frame and then a frame for the door itself with a doorknob, but it was an open middle portion. And Béranger's mirror was just sort of an open circle with no reflective glass in it. But the other props, things like the glasses, the bottles, the flowers that were on the tables, the baguettes that the shopkeepers were selling or whatever it was, all of these were maybe about that thick, right? About maybe 3/4 of an inch or so. And they were just flat on both sides with black and white designs drawn or painted or printed on them, whatever it was. So when Béranger picked up the brandy bottle and poured brandy into a glass, he was basically grabbing a thing, I don't know, sort of like this, right? Like about the width of the phone. And he would pour, and then out of the cup, you drink like that, right? So it wasn't actual props as such. It was an echo of props, right? And so it created this really interesting and eerie sense of this being a hollow world, right? And so it had this sort of great visual resonance with the existential angst of the play.